Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us, and welcome to another Depth Psychology Alliance community conversation. The title of our event today is Racism in America, Integrating the Shadow. My name is James Newell. I'm the somewhat reluctant director of the Depth Psychology Alliance, having been drafted by the founder of the Depth Psychology Alliance, Dr. Bonnie Bright, to fill her position as she went off into the world to do other things after she got her degree. So we have joining us today a wonderful panel for our discussion. Wonderful thinkers, Jungian analyst and author Dr. Fanny Brewster is with us, and Dr. David Ragland, who is an activist, educator, and scholar. And I'll give you more background on them as we continue. So what we've done usually with these community conversations over the years is to try to focus on issues from the perspective of depth psychology. And as we know from the work of Carl Jung, we humans have a tendency to bifurcate into opposites and opposing positions that are opposite to each other and often are self-defeating. So on the other hand, even though we don't want to get polarized into opposites, sometimes it's clear that you do have to take a very specific position. I live in the state of South Carolina, and there's a politician and attorney here in South Carolina named Bakari Sellers, who recently said that today we're really left with only two choices. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. There's really no room. It's reached this, it's been at a crisis point for a long time, but now it's entered enough into the public consciousness that we really need to be active in whatever ways we can. And so we want to explore how we can do that today from, of course, from a depth psychology perspective, but also just whatever perspectives can work in a positive, life-affirming way. So naturally, we at the Depth Psychology Alliance take the position that we want to do everything we can to be anti-racist, and the question arises naturally, how can we achieve this from a depth psychology perspective? There are many different ways to approach this, and we've approached it in the past through these community conversations, talking about the relationship between trauma and multi-generational trauma, and how that has resulted from the impacts of racism through the centuries. One approach that I want to introduce today, just as one starting point that we can use or move around from, is just the idea that the narrative around racism throughout the period of the civil rights movement and up to the present has been one of ending segregation and initiating the integration of African people into white society. And of course, that's a worthy goal. On the other hand, I would like to suggest that from the Jungian perspective, the onus isn't really on African-American people to integrate into white society. The onus is on white people to integrate their own shadows, which they have projected onto people of color for centuries, and on so many other groups upon whom we just tend to project our inadequacies. And I think most of us have an idea of the idea of projection as a defense mechanism, and how Jung talked about the shadow being traits of our own that we project into culture, into individuals, but we also do this on a cultural level. So I also want to underline, just before we move on, I want to introduce our panelists and ask them to say something that places their voices in relation to the topic. I've kind of said my little bit there, but I want to underline also that when we talk about racism, one of the groups of voices that is often not heard, and we at the Depth Psychology Alliance are supporters of the Native American Heritage Association, which supports people in the Pine Ridge and the Sioux communities in North Dakota and South Dakota. So Native voices often are not heard, and they're still being very, very badly treated and suffer greatly as a result of racism towards them. So I think I've said enough. Just to get us started off, what I want to do is introduce our two panelists, who are also going to share some thoughts. I'm going to introduce them, just say a little bit about both of them, and then we'll start out with Dr. Brewster. And I know she's going to, we're going to all be I'm very, very thrilled to have Dr. Fanny Brewster with us. She's a core faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and she's the author of several wonderful books, including The Racial Complex, A Jungian Perspective on Culture and Race. Her most recent book is Archetypal Grief, Slavery's Legacy of Intergenerational Child Loss. And her first book was African Americans and Jungian Psychology, Leaving the Shadows. And we're also very fortunate and very happy to have with us Dr. David Ragland. Dr. Ragland co-leads the Campaign for Truth and Reparations, which supports faith and spiritual communities around the U.S. to create reparative relationships with Black-led grassroots organizations. He's also one of the co-founders and co-directors of the Truth Telling Project, which began in the early days of the Ferguson Uprising to shift the narrative of the protests and the police violence. David also teaches at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Community Liberation and Eco-Psychology, and he was recently inducted.
Yes, I'm also listening to a conference, but well, here's what maybe you can help me find it. I'm looking for the hopefully I'm not. Oh,
David, are you okay? Oops. So he also teaches. He's recently inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars at Morehouse College. So we're very fortunate to have both of them, and I want to ask Fanny, if you're ready, what are your thoughts? And I know you have many.
Maybe I have very few. I don't know.
Well, we'll see. Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. So my experience when I first read the title, you know, it gives me like a multitude of emotions and ideas kind of colliding together. The topic that was on for today, integration of the shadow, right? Which is Jungian language about healing oneself and learning how to deal with things that are hidden, things in the dark. And Jung spoke about the shadow as an archetype, and then others who followed him referenced the shadow and did a good amount of development of the idea of shadow. In the historical piece about shadow, in Jungian language and Jungian understanding, in terms of the dream work, was that anyone who was a person of color, Latina, von Franz wrote about that, Latina or Africanist origin, were containing all the darkness of the individual. They were containing all that was negative and not positive in the individual. I think that that's important to note, because when I look at deconstructing Jungian psychology, I'm thinking about the principles that underlay the psychology and how it may not be practiced in the same way, but believing in the unconscious, I understand that shadow continues. It's an archetype. It doesn't go away. That we act out of that shadow in relationship to how we treat people and how we're connected. And, you know, I have my own personal shadow, and then there's the collective shadow. So the writing that Jung did early on, in terms of the way he wrote and his ideas about Africanist people, needed to be deconstructed. And shadow was certainly, and I think continues to be, something that could be developed and looked at, especially nowadays with the way we are, not just in America, but around the world, really, and looking at ethnicity. We're all one race, but in looking at ethnicity and differences, we have these major, painful, horrific experiences. And I think that's a part of the archetype of shadow getting constellated and activated, which I propose is the core of the racial complex. So I'll just open with that.
Well, that's a good opening and wonderfully said. You may want to say a little more just about what you mean by racial complex before we. Okay. I do want to move on, but.
Oh, sure. So I wrote this book called The Racial Complex, a Jungian perspective on culture and race. And what drew me to write that book was, of course, my own analytical work and working on my own complexes through the time that I spent in analysis in my training to become an analyst, even before I did the training. Jung talked about complexes. He had a theory about complexes and how they possess us. It's a part of our unconscious selves, and we act out of them. Most of us, probably all of us sitting here, have had some conversation within the self or with our analysts or therapists, friends, about our complexes. Typically, it's about the mother complex. Jung wrote quite a bit about parental complexes. He said that they never go away, our complexes, that we always have them. As I started looking at raciality in America and started thinking about issues around the difficulty that we as Americans have in treating people of color with respect, with care, with believing that they are human beings and not beasts. We have such a poor history from before slavery. So as I started thinking about how to write about this through a Jungian lens, one of the main ways that came to me was thinking about the complex. With the complex, this unconscious self can, from the individual, gets energized, and then they act out and do something horrific, as in the murder of George Floyd, done on an individual level. Or it gets constellated, a complex, what I'm calling a racial complex. And we have an eruption. We had a civil war. Like, we could talk about that. Or we could talk about Dr. King's movement that started in the late 50s, constellated by a cultural racial complex. So that for me, a racial complex, which Jung talked about, he mentioned it in the early 30s as a color complex, right? And no one, very few people, I don't want to say no one, but Michael Vanoy Adams, a Jungian analyst in New York, wrote a book called The Multicultural Imagination. It's a beautiful book. And he mentions a color complex and talks a little bit about the history. But no one else in Jungian psychology has done that for almost 100 years. So placing that theory, Jung's theory, which I disagree with what he did say about the color complex, most of it, and he didn't say that much, but I wanted to amplify what he said because it seemed like almost 100 years later, we are living out a racial complex, and especially in Jungian circles, we don't even know how to analyze that complex, or how to talk about it, how to think about it. And yet it affects us. It certainly affects us, having come out of slavery. It affects all of us. So it seemed like a challenging topic to write about, a racial complex. It seemed like it could get me in a lot of quote unquote trouble. It could, which is okay. I could tolerate that edge or margin, whatever you want to call it, right? And it seemed like it could bring Jung's work forward, because I think that Jung has some things of value to say that are really important. And there are things that I absolutely disagree with him about. So it seemed like developing this idea of a complex in terms of raciality seemed like a good way to go.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. And I recommend everyone here, I assume, is interested in depth psychology and interested in this topic of racism. And Fanny's books are just really. I was stunned. We did a project on a conversation on racism 2015, and then another one I think 2016 or 17, and there was no resources. I was so stunned when I saw that your books had been, in that interim, your books have been published, and really just really deal with them in ways that no one, as you said, no one ever has. And it's just very grateful to you. And I recommend to everybody here to take a look. So thank you. And we've got, I know you've stimulated a lot of thoughts and questions. I'd like to bring David, are you with us? I know he's also got some thoughts.
I am.
Yeah, so everyone, thank you, David, Dr. David Ragland. What are your thoughts on this? I know you have many too.
Sure. I'm just honored to be here, especially with Dr. Brewster, who we haven't met, but we talked on the phone once. So I'm just really happy in this moment because you're a hero of mine. And rather than, I'm not a depth psychologist, and I teach the restorative justice and peace building, reconciliation, and courses around reparations at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I want to just share a little bit about my work and how that connects with what we're talking about today. And when Mike Brown was killed, I was a faculty member at Bucknell on the East Coast. And in St. Louis, Mike Brown's birthday, or the day he was murdered by Darren Wilson, is the day that my mother's birthday and my nephew's birthday. So I was just, over the summer break and preparing to go back to school. And I was talking to a friend from St. Louis, and I was telling him about a course I just taught where we were, looking at the Israeli occupation of Palestine and that colonization that's happening there. And what he said to me was profound and changed how I thought about protest, because when Mike Brown was murdered, I wasn't shocked. And I'm sad to say I wasn't shocked, because it was, even in 2014, it was happening over and over. And to shield myself, I tried to not pay as much attention to it. And he told me, we have our own Gaza here in St. Louis. And at that moment, I became activated, and some colleagues asked me what I was doing because I work in restorative justice and work around healing and peace education and stuff like that. And so, to make a long story short, we started this project that was really concerned with healing and conversation and being there. And we ended up really exploring truth and reconciliation as a possibility to deal with racial healing in this country. And after we ended up creating these a quasi truth commission, or we called it the Truth Initiative, where Black folk in St. Louis and people who had experienced police violence could share their stories and be validated in a way that the broader society, maybe now is happening, but up to that point was denying what had happened, even in the face of videos, horrific, violent videos. People would tell their stories, and I would notice that, white folk would come and cry or ask me, questions about that I felt was in part about feeling better about themselves, because I had, I come to see police violence as this manifestation of the wishes of white America. There was recently an article where this museum scholar was describing Afrofuturist exhibition in Germany, there were no Black people at all. There were artists. It was only items of Black people, possessions and artwork, but no Black artists. And it made me think about how there's this kind of commodification, this instrumentalizing Blackness that happens in this country, but our presence is unwanted. So when people call the police for Black folks just barbecuing in the park, it's just the emergence or reemergence of the complex, I believe, that Dr. Brewster is talking about. That's always present, even in people who, are considered good liberal folk who voted for Obama. And I began to think, and that truth and reconciliation, and we called our project the Truth Telling Project because we had, from that point, we already believed that we needed a lot of work to get to reconciliation, that it just would not happen right away. And I just really began believing that we need reparations, that repair is necessary. And so that led me to down a series of rabbit holes, but I began working with Fellowship of Reconciliation and Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, coming to the table, and we all developed an NCOBRA, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations, and we developed reparations campaign where we were really interested in helping faith-based and spiritual communities and ethically centered organizations make connections with Black-led grassroots organization, and we were calling it reparative relationships. And we were looking at reparations from the United Nations perspective, which looks at repair in 5 dimensions. And one is compensation. The other is restitution, returning what was stolen. And the others are satisfaction, which for me is about, and the United Nations describes it as shifting our culture. And we can see it now as people are destroying statues and removing statues of racist people, people who own slaves, colonizing people who like Christopher Columbus, who was a child trafficker and a rapist, among other things. But shifting that culture. And then the other areas of healing, mental, spiritual, physical, because the impact of slavery in the world that it created was not just around emotional trauma. It's trauma that we carry at a cellular level in our bodies, a la Dr. Joyce DeGruy. And then finally, guarantees of non-repeat. And for me, that concept, along with the others, offered so much possibility because what does it mean to guarantee that you won't do or act in ways that created the situation that we are in now? And that's complex. That is completely about addressing the shadow. And it's not just about you not showing microaggressions or you hiring more Black people in your institution. It is completely about uncovering and reflecting on our daily practices and ways in which we are bound up and complicit in injustice that happens against our planet, indigenous people, Black folks, Latinx folks, every single day. And all we have to do is look at our retirement accounts and see ways in which we personally benefit from violence against the planet by what we're invested in. And if we think about, for instance, Brawny paper towels as a consumer-facing product, it's a product owned by the Koch brothers, and the Koch brothers are responsible for pushing emergency management systems, which we can see in Detroit. And people who live in Detroit have been denied water and are still being denied water amidst a coronavirus crisis. And you know, how many mutual funds do we have are invested in equity that keeps consumer-facing products and financial instruments alive, that keep Black bodies and the bodies of people who are very vulnerable, looking for a better place, migrating here in cages. And so at every way, and even myself, we find ourselves complicit in violence and moral monsters without thinking. And
thank you, David. Yeah.
Let me finish. It requires an unraveling. And now I'm done.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. Now, what you made me think of is someone mentioning recently that while people talk about equality, at the same time that Black people and people of color are fighting for equality, they're also being denied equity. I mean, this is related to what you're saying, and the equity is being built. Things were built into the GI Bill, things were built into the early projects to help people after the war that were explicitly denied to people of color. And so exactly what you're saying, it's been deeply built into the.
Because we're asked to demand equity in a system that is about theft and extraction from people.
Yeah.
And sure, I do want equity in that. Yeah, like that's how my family is going to live. But at the same time, like, justice demands that we change this system. Mm-hmm. This is the moment.
Absolutely, thank you. What I want to do is, and we could all, you know, both you and Dr. Brewster could, I know, share a lot of very useful things. What we want to do is have a conversation, though, and try and open up to people who have questions or thoughts or comments or what have you. There's a couple ways we can do this. You can, I think there's a mechanism to raise your hand. There's also a mechanism to just unmute yourself and speak out. And you can also write there's a little chat thing. Looks like Ellen has said, I would like to hear again the last few words that David said before James started speaking. So I interrupted you and she didn't hear that. Do you remember what that was?
I was just thinking about, how do we unravel ourselves from complicity? How do we stop being moral monsters?
Thank you. So any other thoughts, questions, comments for either Dr. Brewster or David?
Yeah, I have a thought. I have been kind of working side by side.
Could you just tell us your name?
Yes, my name is Karen Brannon.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, and I've been involved with Jungian psychology for quite some time, but I've also been involved with shadow work in my family's racial history for a very long time, and have actually been kind of working in tandem and parallel to David without ever having met him, but I certainly know of his work because when I started investigating my family's shadow, going back to slavery and a lynching in 1912, I looked up, I was looking for support. I was looking for people that might be doing the same thing I was doing. And this was in 1995 I started, so there wasn't a whole lot going on. But I found a group called Coming to the Table, which was started by Black and white descendants of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and some other people you might have heard of. And we were doing our root work back then and finding each other, finding kinfolk or people we were connected to across the color line, so to speak, and beginning to, go deeply into how we were not only descended from people who had done monstrous things, but were in fact carrying that shadow ourselves. And that got me involved with Jungian psychology. And I had to hold my nose with a lot of Jung's thought because I recognized it as racist. But it also, the work, that his followers were doing and his analysts were doing really got me through some very hard, painful times. So I just, want to say that there are groups like Coming to the Table and like the groups that David's working with, and a lot of the community projects that are spinoffs from Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative that are doing lynching memorial work all over the country that are beginning to grapple with this long delayed important work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. I wonder, I know Fanny, I don't know if you've seen Fanny's first book on the shadow in Jungian psychology. And she talks a lot about Jung's, the own kind of racist content of Jung's work. Did you want to say something about that, Fanny? You still with us?
Fanny, you're muted.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
You're still muted.
Still, oh,
There you are. There you are.
I wanted to respond first to what David was saying and talking about my own support for reparations. I think that psychologically, it has been a huge, enormous block for people of African ancestry to get over around. It won't happen for reconciliation without reparations. I honestly believe that. I have had, my ancestors came into Charleston, South Carolina on a slave ship. And for generations, they worked and slaved on rice plantations. And I know for myself, I have so much pain and anguish archetypally because of that. And it would have been, of course, good if my ancestors had been able to get some reparations back then. And it would still be even better now if myself and my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren would have that, because then psychologically, I feel that there is some consciousness somewhere in the American psyche to support a deep healing, because the damage and the suffering was so horrific and enormous, and reparation is just one avenue for repair. It's just one, and we can't even get there to do that yet. And the request for it, the demand for it, the intention for it will not go away, because the burden of looking at the economics that whites achieved based on the backs and the bodies of Black people, like that's in our psyche, that's in our collective psyche, and that's not going anywhere.
Well,
So,
and we find this whole problem with people trying to explain American exceptionalism, and the fact is that the only reason Americans have been exceptional is because they had free labor and they stole the entire continent from the native people, and that's American exceptionalism. So if you if you remove that, then the exception is a shameful one, not a proud one.
Yes, that's right. So now I've talked about that, and so I'll come back to you, James, and ask you, what's the question again?
Well,
That I wrote about the shadow in.
You wrote about the shadow in. Well, she had mentioned just that she was reading Jung's work, and there's so much racist things there. And I know you've got a whole book kind of talking about how that impacted the Jungian movement itself and the theory and everything.
Yes. Well, I think one of the biggest difficulties has been that there has been this silence. Helen Morgan is a Jungian analyst, British, and she and I are in fact co-authoring another book, mutually co-authoring a book on Jung and racism and our ancestral lineages, legacies, and where they cross. And in looking at shadow and in looking at the history of Jungian psychology, it has been shadowed. Jung himself had a shadow, and American Jungian psychology, in terms of ethnicity and people of color, they've just been unable for a long time to tolerate shining any light on that shadow. And it's only, like I said before, one or two people, Polly Young-Eisendrath, a Jungian analyst in 1987, wrote an article, "Why are there no Black Jungian analysts?" And there were none. And the reason why there were none is because the material is so, when you look at the collected works and you have to look at this material, you think this is so racist, this is unimaginable that someone could be writing this about people. Africanist people, but not unimaginable, because Jung followed along the line of missionaries and anthropologists and, Freud and people who never even went to Africa, and somehow or another got into that line of thinking. And so African Americans became the shadow, became the negative of whites. And so whites could not carry their own shadow. So when I write about leaving the shadows, it's African American people leaving the shadow of Jungian psychology that said that, along with the rest of American society, that we were nothing and we were the darkness in a way that was negative and the worst of everything.
Thank you for talking about that. Yeah, and it's a wonderful work, and really, as you said, it was a courageous first book to be writing as a Jungian.
I wanted to say something, because at the time that I wrote that book, there were 3 of us, Jungian analysts, and then a 4th, 2 men both from San Francisco Jung Institute, myself and another woman, Ada Gonzalez, who is also in the San Francisco Institute. So there are still only 4 of us. And of course, the reason for that is because of the work that Jung did in creating theories that were so racially biased. The Freudian groups and Adlerians and Gestalt therapy have all been talking about integration, have all been more capable of integrating people of color into their psychologies and their institutes, even though they do still have problems and difficulties there with racism. All institutions do in America, right? But they've still been able to at least talk about it, where in Jungian society and the Jungian collective, it's been impossible. And you're not allowed to in the training programs, or you haven't been. That's been the history of it, that you come through your training to become a Jungian analyst, and it's basically forbidden to have conversations about race or racism. That works to the detriment, actually, of depth psychology, and I think it has. So my books are trying to address that, and to have these kinds of conversations. And coming here today is a part of that, right?
Yeah, thank you. How I'm shocked to hear you say that. How did they operationalize that? I mean, people just ignore it, or do they actively say, "Don't talk about race"? I mean, how?
Yeah, they don't talk about race, and Jung is a man of his times.
Uh-huh. Oh, so in other words, it sounded like if you said that, you're criticizing daddy or something, and you can't do that. Yeah.
Yes. Well, there's some people, you know, they used to say, maybe some people still do, that, you know, Jungians are cult followers, or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they're
Sure.
part of a cult. And so Jung can be worshipped by some. He can be idealized. You know, he can just be someone who we have, you know, such great awe for. I don't say we, because I'm not in that category of having great awe for him, but I think the work, which he himself said, is to make the unconscious conscious. The work is to move the myth forward. The work is to change. And certainly after almost 100 years of dealing with American Jungian psychology and not dealing with the racial complex, we have to get there. We have to have some kind of conversation about this and break what Helen Morgan calls a British silence about it, which is the same here in American Jungian psychology. So there was a need for it, a need to open it up. And I think it's something that Jungian psychology wanted. I'm not so sure that they knew how to do it, right? Like, I'm not so sure that there was an understanding of how to talk about racism in Jungian psychology.
Mm-hmm. So, and it's a vitally important topic in terms of Jung and Jungian psychology. How do you see, when I think about racial complex as something that would be such a useful way to understand racism culturally for a lot of people, and yet on the one hand you have people who are complete denial and say, well, there's no racism, and you're just seeing racism where there isn't any racism, and then there's other people who would like to make a change, but they don't know how to approach their own. In other words, on a cultural level, how do you have any thoughts on how culturally we could move towards a treatment for the racial complex?
Yeah, I think that, you know, and I consider this first from a cultural, within a cultural context, right? We come from cultural groups. And so in looking at a collective, and Jung had his own distrust of groups and large groups and collectives, right? I could have that myself, you know, as a person of color, like thinking about lynch mobs and thinking about a blue line and thinking about people that come together, posses that want to harm me because of my skin color, right? So within my culture, my skin culture, I can have a fear of groups. So when we talk about culture, like I think about not the same as the collective. Culture to me is, I have an Africanist culture that I belong to. You, James, have a white culture that you belong to. I don't know your ancestry. I don't know if it's Irish or Germanic or
Mainly Scottish, some Irish. Yeah.
Scottish and some Irish, right? So mine is Africanist, right? So from that culture, I look at a racial complex within me that, let me stretch it a little bit in this direction. Like when I look at the DSM-5 now, diagnostic manual for giving some sort of recommendation to someone's psychological sickness, right? And there's a category in there for paranoia. I feel as a Black woman, I have a right and an intention to hold on to my paranoia because it's healthy. And it's founded on being a Black person in a society where there is such active racism. So that's not a sickness to me. So within my cultural understanding, I believe in having a paranoia that can keep me alive and save my life, right? So when we talk about a complex, Jung said that we do not get rid of our complexes. We learn how to befriend our complexes. We learn how to work with our archetypal energy that comes through us. And in working with that archetypal energy, we learn how to recognize it and say, okay, this is something in me that is taking possession of me, and I don't want to go out and hurt someone. If it's tied to a racial complex where there's so much rage and anger, then you wind up going like Dylann Roof in Charleston, South Carolina, and that racial complex on an individual level gets so activated that you go out and you kill people in a house of prayer. You kill Black people in a church. You bomb a church. That's an activation of a racial complex. So how do you work with it? You have to have enough willingness to say, I have a problem. I have a problem dealing with people of color who are not white people. I'm looking at it from that perspective, right? Du Bois talked about how he was considered to be the problem. He said, people look at me and they think I'm the problem. He said, I'm not the problem, they're the problem. But they keep looking at me like I'm the problem. They want to send me back to Africa. They want to do all these things with me. So there's something that has to happen on an individual level. And speaking from a depth psychological perspective, Jung talked about it as morality, that's what saves us. That's what holds us. Like that's our anchor. And that happens on an individual level, morality. And then there is the outside, the collective. And then we can perhaps influence the collective, like millions of people going out and protesting around what's going on racially with police violence. But first, it has to come from something inside. And we have to be able to say, I recognize in myself, as some Aryans have done and some whites have done, and more whites are saying, you know, there's something here. It's my white guilt. It's my white defenses. It's my white privilege. It's like there has to be some self-reflection. So I think that that's actually the first place where it begins, an inner conversation around that.
Thank you. Yes, individually. We've got several questions coming up now. We've got Kevin Baker and Cindy Pratt have had their hands raised, and also Donna Gans has put something in the comments. So the people, Cindy or Kevin, do you want to unmute yourselves and say something? Kevin,
yes. Thank you so much for having this conversation, and I look forward to reviewing it over and over again. Thank you so much, Dr. Brewster and Dr. Ragland. I'm first wondering if there would be an opportunity, if you would be willing to share your contact information, because I would like to have further conversations with both of you. I'm a Black man living in the Pacific Northwest, originally from the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And most of my degrees were, the foundation of them was depth psychology. And here's my thought and question I'd like for you to respond to, Dr. Brewster. And I did order your books yesterday. So, you know, I too looked at and said that Jung was a man of his time, right, with his views, and also realized and saw that, of course, he was a racist, right, and saw that he went and studied African spiritual systems and practices and beliefs, and then turned them into depth psychology. Right. So in essence, through my thinking and what I've studied, depth psychology is African spiritual systems that is just something else that was stolen by white people and renamed. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I agree with what you're saying, that Jungian psychology, and Carl Jung, he did make a few trips to Africa. One of those trips to Africa, he came back and he said he was extremely afraid and was frightened by a dream that he had had there. And he was afraid of going Black, going primitive. This was his anxiety about having gone to Africa and that fear. And yet, Jung took work from anthropologists, Levi Bruhl. He took work from others who had made journeys to Africa, white men, and decided that rites of passage, for example, could be incorporated into Jungian psychology. I remember in my own studies to become a Jungian analyst, there was a good amount of talk about rites of passage. And that basically comes from what whites saw when they went to Africa and incorporated into, Jung certainly incorporated it into his work. The idea of, it's called participation mystique, the idea that individuals come together and they lose consciousness, they lose themselves, was a term developed by an anthropologist to describe Africans and describe what then Jung turned it into being a lower level of consciousness, because that was a part of the hierarchy that he said existed in terms of someone being of Africanist ancestry, Africans on the bottom and whites on the top. So to go into a participation mystique kind of experience means to be losing one's conscious and to be quote unquote primitive. So yes, Jung, and not only Jung, others also came and took from Africa, stole from Africa, as in the stealing of our bodies, the stealing of concepts, and then use them to develop and enhance his own psychological theories. And once those theories were written in a way that Africanist people would be at the bottom of that hierarchy. And that's the painful history of Jungian psychology that got realized over and over and over again when it came to be developed in America as American psychology.
Thank you so much for that response. And just wondering if there's any way to reach out to you. And Dr. Raglan. Also wondering if Dr. Raglan is familiar with Institute of Black World 21st Century and yourself and the work being done through that organization around reparations.
Very much. I work with Dr. Daniels closely.
Oh, very good, very good. I'm on the board, so I'm glad that connection is made. And
put your email in the thing, we can be in contact.
Thank you so much.
Yes. For me also, leave your email and
Yes,
I'll be in
ma'am.
touch with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you all.
We'll save the chat, so I'll make sure that they get it if they don't see it themselves in there.
Okay.
Thank you, Kevin, so much. We also have a question from Cindy Pratt. You still there, Cindy?
Yes, I just got myself unmuted. I live in Minneapolis, where we have an opportunity, it looks like, to redo the police force and create something new with a new vision. It's going to go on the ballot November, and it looks like it's probably going to go through. And I'm just wondering if either of you, both of you, have any wisdom in how we could restructure that in a new way.
You talking about the police force itself?
Well, we're going to get rid of the police force. We're going to abolish the police force, and we're going to have other things in place to serve the people and keep the peace. Truly.
So your question is, do they have any thoughts on how that would best work?
Right, or any revisioning, or even what role, I'm a psychologist, what role mental health professionals could play, and probably for Fanny, addressing the shadow in reconstructing that, and just if you have any wisdom about that, I'd like to hear it.
Mhm. Well, I know that I saw something recently on the news. It was on CNN, and they ran a piece about the Camden, New Jersey police force, which got disbanded totally because they said it was so corrupt and they had to get rid of it and
Yes.
start again. So they brought police back in, and one of the major parts of the police force is that they are engaged with community, and they are involved with community. And I grew up partly in New York, in Brooklyn, New York, when policemen joined people in community in kind of a basically friendly way. We had the same police officers walking the block, walking the beat when I was growing up during that time period. So there was um, maybe because I was a child, I wasn't a visible threat in a way that if I was male and a little bit older, I would have been. I realized that, of course. So I don't think my own personal view, is that I don't believe in the police. I have to say that. And someone could say, oh, like, well, but you would if you really needed them. Well, there are times I've needed them. I had a tenant who, I'll tell you a short story, a tenant who, she wasn't a tenant. She was just someone that I had felt some empathy for and had been thrown out from the house across the street. And I brought her in to stay with me for a little while, for a couple of weeks. And then she decided she didn't want to go and she wanted to become a squatter. And I had to call the police, and the lawyer said that was the first thing I needed to do. And I called the police, and the police showed up, and they were treating her as if she was a victim and as if I was the person who was in the wrong for trying to have her leave. She was a white woman. So this is a very extremely mild situation because I've had others, but this is a mild circumstance where the police showed up and they didn't even want to listen to what I had to say, even though I was trying to get this woman out of my house and I had called them. This is like nothing compared to someone being murdered by the police. But it's a constant reminder, right, that there is a blue line, and it wasn't created to protect and serve me. And I understand that. And so when I think about Camden, getting rid of the old police and bringing in new ones, and how there's a better relationship, they're saying better rapport, I'm still suspicious of that. I really am. And I'm thinking maybe we could do counseling and mediation, and presenting that as a model for how we work with problems in our community, because oftentimes the justification for killing a Black man is, oh yeah, well, we didn't know he was mentally ill. Well, why not? Is that not a part of your training? Like, and so if you don't know that and you've been trained to understand mental illness and you still show up with a gun, then maybe we do need to get rid of you and let people come who are psychologists and counselors and mediators and who can have compassion and empathy first rather than a gun. Because, the idea is that once you pull the gun, you're going to shoot to kill. That seems to be a part of that culture. It's not, I'm shooting them in the leg or I'm going to injure them and say, no, it's shoot to kill. And so, yeah, if that's where they're at, and that's what we have to look forward to, then what hope would there ever be? Thinking about shadow integration, right? How would that happen? Where's the consciousness there in that community of police people, right?
I completely agree with everything Dr. Brewster said, and I would just reiterate that issue about the majority of training that police receive is about killing, and they often act in the way they've been trained, and too little in the other piece. Also, I think, you know, I believe in complete abolition. You know, I think we're, you know, the behaviorist model of like punishment, you know, is how we're sort of oriented. Like you're going to get punished, you know, like that's the only reason why people obey laws. Most people actually don't, but only Black people suffer from it, or for a large piece of it. And then the history of policing in this country is one of the way that police were created was in light of the Slave Fugitive Act. And so modern policing came from that. And I think we keep trying to find equilibrium when the system is the problem. And policing is a tool of capitalism, as slave catchers were a tool of the slave system. And I want to caution us all that as we began working to abolish police, we should look at what happened in Iraq after they abolished the police and the military. ISIS was created. And so if we abolish policing, I think there has to be a program in place to work with police. They should be required to demilitarize completely, or there will be problems. And I've also written an article about re-envisioning policing, which I just put in the chat.
Wonderful, thank you, David. That's I wanted, if there's more on this, please continue. There was another hand raised that I wanted to address, but if there's more.
I know, you know, I think, you know, what Dr. Brewster is saying is right on. You know, we don't need police. I think what we need is values, the larger piece of society. We need to like figure out how do we stop exporting like the violence that's internally like to everyone else and or to this group of people who are supposed to solve our problems. The police exist because white people in America want it. So yeah, that's all I had to say, but feel free to check out this article. And I will say that I worked on this for a while after Mike Brown was killed. Another colleague and I. So the officer who killed Mike Brown, similar to Camden, he had been fired along with a lot of other police officers before becoming a Ferguson police officer in a town called Jennings, which is right next to Ferguson, one of these mini municipalities that like essentially operated as an obstacle to Black people who moved out of the urban center of St. Louis. And they disbanded the Jennings police probably about 15 years ago in order to deal with all of the like complaints. The first time I had been pulled over by police, I was with my uncle and I was 6 years old. And he was driving through Jennings and he was just back from serving the U.S. In South Korea. And what we proposed to Jennings, because they were coming around to review, was a phased, like rather than hiring back the police, we essentially argued that we should be spending money on social workers, counselors, people who do violence de-escalators, mediators, and maybe like a detective and one or two officers to deal with like heinous crimes, you know, or either contract with someone else. But in what we proposed was, in this phased approach, part of it would be having like helping to create relationships among people in the community. And we had at our center a community garden. as a way that people could like create garden shares and connect with each other and begin to see each other as human, but also begin to meet each other's needs, in addition to learning all these other things. And we described cases like in Richmond, California, which had one of the highest murder rates. At one point, they used a non-violent de-escalation group to look and target people who were likely to commit crimes with opportunities, jobs, education. The data shows educate people, they're not going to commit crime. But the larger issue is violence in our society. Like the grand narrative of the society is violence. The grand narrative in literature is violence. Man against man, man against society, man against God, man against nature. And I think we need to change the way we think about violence. And we spend so much money on violence, we have not developed the capacity for creativity and peace. And so like we're overrun with violence everywhere. And we're in sore need of a new narrative and a new way to educate and bring people into our society.
And thank you, David. And we've not even touched on mass incarceration, which is just a whole other system of slavery, which is just a horrible buying and selling of bodies, which we don't have time to even touch that. But thank you for all you said about that. I want to get to this other. I don't know how to say this name. It's LJLEWISTHAER. You got your hand up?
That's me. My name's Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, thanks.
Sure.
I've had comments for a while, and so I'm going to try to frame this in I hope I can be articulate. Just to give some framework, I'm a Jungian analyst trained in Zurich. And, you know, one of the things that I want to say is that I grew up in very white bread Christian suburbia, but somehow as a young child, I knew how profoundly problematic this was. And I started thinking about reparations, for example, when I was 9, and how we could begin to deal with some of the profound injustice that tears at the deep fabric, I think, of everyone's being. And one thing, and David, I'm going to direct this to you quite a bit, when I hear that, you know, we have police because white people want them, it feels so divisive. I know I'm an ignorant white woman. I know that I have so much to learn, and I know that none of us can be fully unembedded from the culture that we have been raised in. But I think for those of us who have some deep morality and humanity, that these are powerful issues. And to just say white people, it's so othering. And I wonder, is there any way that you can accept that perhaps you have allies who have white skin and include us in the way that you speak about these issues so that we can join with you rather than being thrown out? So that's one thing. You know, I want to say racism in Jungian psychology is a huge issue, and I think there needs to be a differentiation between racism and prejudice, and refusal to look, which I put in with racism. One person in Zurich who's trying to address this very directly is Peter Amann, who has taken many trips to Africa to really engage in conversation and to bring African shamans to Zurich to start to have some kind of discussion. It's not enough, it's a small thing, but he's been very actively bringing up the question for I don't know, 10 or 15 years. And I know for myself, part of being in Zurich that was so great is I got to work with people from 32 different countries. And that's how I try to educate myself, is through exposure, which I started at 9. So one thing is, I guess my question is, how do you think as Jungians we can start to engage this more directly, more constructively? And also, is there a way that you can include white people as part of the solution? I'm totally behind truth and reconciliation. I'm behind defunding police. I'm behind reparations, and I have been for, I don't know, almost 4 decades. So my heart just breaks when I hear these white people terminologies. It hurts.
I'm going to let another white person answer. I think that, I'm sorry your heart breaks.
Well, why?
I have a question. I'm not white. I'm a black man, but I'm wondering, why are you not practicing what you preach and tell others? Why aren't you willing to sit in your discomfort?
Well,
do we have to now placate you so that you don't feel bad, so that then you can, feel like you can do something?
No, it's not about that. I'm saying, can you accept that perhaps you have allies that have white?
Can you accept that you are a racist and that you need to begin to practice anti-racist ways? Why do we have to accept and make something comfortable for you?
I'm not asking you to make it comfortable to me.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Wait, Kevin, I'm not. And I can tell you, when I was 14 years old, and I said to my white sister, I'm not prejudiced. And she said, of course you're prejudiced. You're a middle-class white girl. I've been struggling with this since then. And I want to learn, and I take it up actively. But I do want to have a way to enter the conversation as a human being.
Well, see, that's the problem, right? That's the problem right there. Let me say that I don't believe in white allyship, because nothing is required of allyship. I believe in white advocacy, because advocacy requires you to put something on the line, right? And what I'm hearing from you, maybe it's not your intention, but what I'm hearing from you is that you have to feel comfortable, and you don't like the fact that we may use language that makes you feel uncomfortable, and therefore you feel put out and then don't want to advocate or do any work.
No, I don't, it's not true for me. And if you could just hear me out. What I'm saying is that, oh gosh, it's so upsetting that it's really hard to find the right words. And I know that I'm ignorant. I know I will use wrong words.
You're also hijacking.
What's that?
I just said you're also hijacking.
Oh dear.
Well,
yes, she is.
Well, okay, so my name is Jutta Schamp, and my ancestry is German, and I've done a lot of work around whiteness and the non-Jewish German subject position, and I feel what Dr. Ragland and what Dr. Brewster are saying is actually true. I think we as white people, we need to take a look at our shadow and often perpetration. And I think we need to engage with our unconscious, and I feel we need to unravel that layer by layer. I really like the way you put that, Dr. Ragland, that you said we are every day we are complicit, and I noticed that myself. I mean, I consider myself a liberal, but I have had many instances where I saw, yes, there's the white shadow, you know, it crops up. And I think, as you were saying, we need to do the inner work. You know, we can't allow African Americans to do the inner work for us. I think we really need to go inside and yeah, face that shadow.
I just want to briefly add, I totally agree with that this, for the very first time, is an opportunity for white people to have to look at ourselves in the way we have identified color in everybody who's not white. Like, this is the first time that I have to wake up and recognize myself as a racist, as someone who desires to learn enough to engage in anti-racism in an active way. And if the term white people hurts, then welcome to the non-white club. I'm sorry, because that is fragility, and that requires a mirror and to go in. I like the term you use, white shadow. Go into the white shadow.
Also, I want to say that having something that Kevin spoke in the chat was that truth is not about division. Speaking what your experience is not about creating division. It's about being seen. It's about me listening and seeing you, David, seeing you, Fanny, seeing Kevin, seeing what I have not been able to see before. And that, to me, hearing that truth is an important part of beginning to somehow offer reparation.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone who's contributing. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that we're kind of scheduled to go till 5 and we're over, and I love that. I'm glad people are engaging. Also, just a little self-disclosure myself. I went to a unusual case of a white man going to an HBCU, which was an historically black college or university, Tennessee State University, and I learned a lot there. One of the things, the most important thing I think I learned there was that what my black friends and colleagues wanted most from me was to listen. They just wanted me to listen, and I made more friends by listening than I could ever have made by prying or trying to get answers and all that. Just listening is a very valuable skill. In counseling, we say a non-anxious presence. And being able to be a non-anxious presence in these conversations, I think, is very, very helpful and useful for all. But thank you all for contributing. And I can go on forever, but I also don't want to impose on our guests, Fanny and David, and all of the listeners who expected maybe a shorter presentation, but I'm very, very happy that we've had this conversation. We can, of course, do it again. Fanny, David, do you all have anything you want to contribute or thoughts that you want to, do you think we should, I know we have more questions, more thoughts. I can bring it to a close, or we can maybe wrap it up in a few minutes if you guys have any closing thoughts.
I think for myself, we could spend another 10 minutes or so before we close, so that those who really feel that they have something they want to say can have those words come out, because I don't know how often we get to have these kinds of conversations within the area of depth psychology. So
yeah, thank you.
So let's just take another 10 minutes or so and just keep talking to one another.
Great.
And I just want to just say quickly, I wanted to be intentional about not responding to that question, and I'm very glad that people in the community here responded. So I'm definitely down to listen for a few more minutes as well.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Cassie, this is David.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you all for your time, your honesty, everyone's vulnerability. It's been a little hopeful to see so many people willing to talk about it. And I guess my question, or it's more of asking about thoughts on something, is, you know, the hell that is social media, where you see all these opinions of people where you're like, oh, you're one, shadow work and in any type of internal work takes time. And there are, to me, what I struggle with sometimes is, you know, I can be doing the work, but you see these people who are so not willing to do the work. And when it comes to how many more people have to die for it, and then when it comes to climate change, sometimes it's like we don't really have the time for it. And I guess I was just asking what your thoughts are on the people that my ego deems as too far gone, because I don't necessarily want to get to a place of, well, there's no time for them, forget about them, like let's just go and almost, and I don't want to be almost moderate in my accommodation of their feelings to try to talk to them because there isn't time. And I have this like battle in between myself of like spending enough time trying to get through to people that my time might be better served elsewhere in some type of radical movement where I don't think about everyone and their feelings and where they've come from and what their conditioning is, because it feels too far gone. And there's so much that's at the expense of such horrible things waiting for people who really don't seem like they'll ever do the work.
Cassie, who are you directing your question to?
Both Dr. Brewster and Dr. Ragland, I guess. Both, yeah. And it's not even, it's kind of an open-ended question of just, I guess, almost what are your opinions on these type of people? I'm sure that you've encountered them too, or maybe all of us have or haven't, and a lot of them comes from where we're from in our homes and having evolved from that, but then having to go back to that. And it's just a little bit, it's been different. I don't know what, I guess I'm just asking for thoughts and opinion on that.
David or Fanny, you have any thoughts on that?
I would just say, like, I think this community is a perfect community to work with white folks who really are not in touch with their whiteness, or you know, I think this is also like the perfect time. You know, I encourage you to like have hope, especially if you're trying to have conversations with folks so that they can deal with what is essentially like a really bad education and culture, a really violent education and culture in this society. And, you know, King at one point said we need a transformation of values from away from militarism, materialism, and racism. And, you know, capitalism is deeply problematic. And in addition to like having the conversations, I think that we need to align ourselves with ways to build something new and undermine the system as much as possible. I'm telling you all, this is a really important moment because we are on the fucking edge. Everybody has to dig in right now.
Thanks, David.
I think that I look at it from the perspective of how you can be the person that you need to be in your life. And for me, it starts from there. And so if you are engaged, you, Cassie, that's your name, right? Are you Cassie? Okay. So if you, Cassie, feel like, you know, there are these people and I want them to be different. I want them to be more conscious and more conscientious around these things that are so important to me. If you can think that and hold the tension within yourself, right, while you learn how to tolerate being with someone who could hate somebody Black, right, or who is a racist, or who doesn't want to change their thinking, Like, you have to be able to tolerate that. And then you take that energy from within yourself, right? Depth psychological, Jungian way, the tension of opposites within you, right? And be able to work that inner material. And then when you resolve it within yourself, thinking about a transcendent function, the emergence of a third within you, and then you can go out and do some work in the world that you feel is designated for your work with people who are on the edge of listening, who they're having a hard time, they're uncomfortable, like Lisa and Kevin having a conversation today with us, right? There is discomfort here for all of us. Nobody's comfortable. That's the moment. This is the moment of a huge discomfort. But people of color are constantly uncomfortable. So it's like, what do we care? It's another moment of intense discomfort, right? So what I would say to you and to other people like you who say, you know, I want these people to be different. Why can't they change? I don't even want to talk to them. Okay, don't talk to them until you can have enough internal conversations with yourself where you feel enough good ego strength, right, to go out and to do the work with those who want to listen, but they don't have the language. They don't know how to be. They don't know how to understand. Take your whiteness and mirror their whiteness and see what happens. So that's how I think about that. Does that make sense to you, Cassie? Yeah.
That was a really great answer. Yeah, very much so. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Fanny. That was lovely. Well, our 10 minutes are almost up.
Can I say one thing quickly?
Sure.
For most of my life, I thought I was not racist, and I did a lot of racial justice work. But things happened, and I decided I had to go into my personal family history back many generations, which many people don't feel they have to do. And I'm not advising it for everyone, but I discovered up until that time, I really had trouble talking to people that were blatantly racist. I had trouble talking with a lot of white people. I thought I was better than all of them. And suddenly, once I got through all this, and it took me decades to do it, now I can talk to people like that because I faced those people that were still in me that I thought I had left behind. And so I get a lot of people who come up to me after I talk about my book and say, oh, I feel so bad for you. I'm so glad I didn't have parents like that, or I'm so glad I didn't have grandparents that lynched people. And I say to them, you can't be sure. You never know. And none of us can be sure. Those of us who never lived in the South don't know that they had grandparents and great-grandparents that ran away from all that. A lot of this stuff has been hidden. And so my sense, what I say to other white people is, especially if you're trying to individuate, I don't know how anyone can individuate without going into their racial, multi-generational family history, including Jungian analysts. And I really doubt that many Jungian analysts have done this kind of work. So that's my 2 bits for today.
Thank you, Karen. And thank you, everybody, everyone, especially, of course, Fanny, Dr. Brewster, and Dr. Ragland. Really, really a wonderful gift you've given all of us to come and take part in this. As I said, we've done this before, and we've not had such strong and well-informed and articulate voices as you two. So thank you so much. Once again, I want to encourage everyone to look up Dr. Ragland on his truth-telling project and other resources related to his work online. Dr. Brewster's also online at Pacifica, and wonderful books. And I'll leave it to you all if you have, either Fanny or David, if you have any final thoughts. Otherwise, I'm about to close up.
I just want to say thank you for showing up today, because it's the first thing that we have to do. We have to show up. So I thank you all for being willing to do that.
Thank you, Fanny. David, any thoughts?
Just thank you all as well. And I've learned so much in this conversation. Let's all keep learning.
Thanks, David. Thank you all for coming, and we will keep your eye on the Depth Psychology Alliance. We'll post, hopefully the recording will do what it's supposed to do, and we will post that after review and make sure that it's something that both David and Fanny are comfortable with us posting. We'll post it online. Thank you all. Take care.